we're very excited to welcome to the show, great guest to the show, all-around great guy, former Attorney General Rob McKenna joins us now. Mr. McKenna, thank you so much for coming on.
It is always great to be with you guys. Thank you so much.
We are so happy to have you. We got in a conversation earlier on the show. We were talking about current Attorney General Nick Brown's response to a bunch of it wasn't a document dump because I think it was a FOIA request, but it was a bunch of emails that the Center Square had gotten their hands on and then had written a piece about the Attorney General's office connection to the language and shaping of the Millionaires tax, Jamie Peterson's Millionaires tax, which is an income tax on all Washingtonians. And Attorney General Nick Brown said, well, this is just like a totally normal part of the process. He spoke about that. I think this was just yesterday or the day before. Let me play you this clip. And then I'd love to get your response to this because I saw a post from you today that called into question what Brown was saying. But we can get to all that in a second. Let me play this clip from Attorney General Nick Brown.
It's very common for AG's offices to advise their clients on the law, the status of cases, analyzing prior Supreme Court decisions. It is something that we do on a regular basis. It is something that all of my predecessors have done. So yes, I think it's pretty common and appropriate.
All right, so that's what he had to say about it, and we would love to get your take on this. Rob McKenna is a former Attorney General, and full disclosure for people, you're part of the legal team who's actually fighting this bill as unconstitutional in court. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, right. Former Supreme Court Justice Phil Talmadge and I have teamed up. We teamed up to overturn the Seattle City income tax about 5 years ago. Now we've teamed up to challenge the constitutionality of this new income tax. And, Phil's a Democrat, I'm a Republican. Phil supports a state income tax as a general matter, as part of, comprehensive tax reform. I don't think an income tax is a good idea, but Phil points out if we're going to have an income tax that doesn't follow the rules for property taxes, we have to amend the Constitution to do it. And that's what every legislature before this year recognized. They 6 times in our state's history since the Constitution was amended to extend the property tax to income, the legislature said, well, we want more than a property tax level of income tax. 6 times they've sent constitutional amendments to the ballot to let the voters have the opportunity to exclude income from the definition of property, which would allow graduated income taxes. And 6 times the voters have said no, by big margins. The last time there was a constitutional amendment to do that on the ballot, the voters turned it down 77 to 23%. And there have been 4 initiatives as well that would have created income taxes. Those have all been defeated. Now, in terms of what General Brown said about, we frequently advise the legislature, and my predecessor AG has advised the legislature. That is true. However, a couple things. One, the legislature has its own lawyers.
That's what I was wondering. I asked Mike this earlier. I said,
hold up. I'm sorry. Rob, let me hear what you say. Say that again, Rob.
No. It's interesting, actually. Phil Talmadge brought this up in an interview we did yesterday because he was a state senator before he was a Supreme Court justice. And he pointed out that the legislature has its own little army of lawyers. They're very talented. They're staff attorneys. They know what they're doing. They know a lot about legislation and statutes and the Constitution. Sometimes the legislature will ask for a second opinion or additional advice from the AG office, but I cannot recall, and Phil could not recall, a single instance in the state's history where the legislature or legislative leader went to the AG office and said, hey, how do I write this bill to get around the Constitution? And then they just actively advised them on that. To the contrary, we would go over to the legislature when we saw a bill being proposed that was constitutionally defective, and we would quietly tell them behind closed doors, hey, we just want you to know what you're about to do violates the Constitution. That's what we would do. But we never, saw our role to be to help them design legislation to overturn the Constitution.
Well, let me ask you this.
Ahead,
I understand what you're saying, Rob. Is if the intention of Jamie Peterson is to have the Constitution changed and get something before the Supreme Court, is there anything untoward or illegal of that?
Well, yes. First, remember that every legislator, just like every attorney general and every governor, takes an oath to uphold and defend the laws and Constitution of the state of Washington. Our Constitution has been interpreted multiple times by the Supreme Court over many decades to hold that income is within the definition of property because our Constitution was amended by the voters to expand the definition of property to include every form of intangible property. And income, of course, is a form of intangible property. So they took an oath, which they then decided to violate by passing a bill which clearly, violates established law as ruled by the Supreme Court multiple times. So they did, they're trying to create a test case and hoping that the Supreme Court will do the job for them, the job they declined to do. Because, as I said, all the other times the legislature decided it wanted a progressive income tax, it sent a proposed constitutional amendment to the voters, let them decide. This legislature is has worked hard to keep this issue away from the voters. They could have hung a referendum clause on it, sent it to the voters, say, what do you think? Do you approve of this? They didn't do it. They included language in the bill that prevents the bill, they think, from being subject to a referendum vote. That's being challenged in a separate lawsuit that I'm not involved with. But they clearly don't want the voters to have their say. And maybe that's because, the voters have had a chance to approve an income tax 10 times, and 10 times in a row they've said no.
Let me ask you this. Again, we're talking to former Attorney General Rob McKenna. There are a lot of people who think that if this does go to the voters, that this is going to be passed and that the voters want an income tax. They just need the opportunity to vote on it. Now, I would say all of the evidence to the contrary, given how they have voted in the past, but there are people who think that, people really want an income tax.
Well, since it's being targeted at just millionaires.
Yes,
but that's their hope. I'm not saying it's valid, but that is their hope, right?
I know why I think you're laughing, and I agree with you, but why are you laughing at that notion, Attorney General Rob McKenna, former Attorney General?
Well, they've come up with this marketing gimmick, right? They call it the Millionaires tax. There's no income tax in our country's history that has been adopted and only applied to the richest people. In 1913, when the federal income tax was first enacted, the rate was 7%, and it only applied to people who made $500,000 or more per year, which was very few people in 1913. And of course, by the 1920s, it had extended to reach basically everybody. And that's true of state income taxes also. You look at California and other states with income taxes, Oregon, other near neighbors, they don't limit them to millionaires. And when you look at the state's budget situation, the fact that they increased spending in the current biennium, I'm told, by about 15%, with about 4% additional revenues, from existing taxes, you begin to see the problem. There's no way they're not going to expand this tax to reach everybody. But regardless of that policy argument, it's really important to understand that this lawsuit that we've brought to overturn this income tax and uphold the Constitution is not just about a millionaire's tax or this particular bill. This test case, which the legislature has succeeded in creating, is about their ability to create any income tax that they want. This is, in other words, when we go to court, if the court upholds this new law, which I don't think they will because it's blatantly unconstitutional, but if they did, it wouldn't just be upholding a millionaire's tax. It would open the door to any income tax the state wants, and it would open the door to allow cities and counties to pass income taxes as well, because we no longer have a statute in this state that prohibits city and county income taxes. We used to have one, and in the Seattle income tax case, some interveners came in and they challenged it and they got it thrown out on technical grounds. So there's no longer a law preventing city and county income taxes. So this is not a test case for millionaires tax. This is a test case for an income tax period, and whether we're going to reimagine our Constitution to not count income as a form of intangible property.
Do you think there has been a lot of reaction? Obviously, it's kind of it's a story that people are talking about when Nick Brown says, that's just wrong. This is not at all what we're doing. This is like all above board. This happens all the time. Do you think people have a genuine gripe in feeling like the Attorney General represents the people and should not be working behind closed doors with legislators on a bill that ends up penalizing the people in the form of an income tax that's maybe unconstitutional? Right. Doesn't it feel like my feeling when I saw that was I was like, well, wait a minute, who elected this guy? Like, who does he work for? Am I wrong in feeling that way?
No, you're not wrong, because the Attorney General was created, that position was created as an independent elected position in the Constitution, in our original Constitution, and under, the idea of checks and balances, separation of powers. The Attorney General is part of the executive branch, and the duty of the executive branch is to uphold the Constitution and the laws and to execute those laws, but not to actively undermine them. And I think people are just really bothered by the idea that the Attorney General allowed his staff to actively collaborate with legislative leaders to design a bill that they hope will cause the Supreme Court to, just reinterpret the Constitution in a way that no court ever has. And look, if the Attorney General is not going to defend the Constitution in these circumstances, who is? When that city, and this is not the first time, by the way, when that city and county income tax prohibition was challenged in court, I think that statute dates all the way back to 1984. But in the Seattle income tax case, when one of the interveners came in and said, because we'd cited that, right, as one of the reasons Seattle couldn't have an income tax. But they came and said, that bill, that's technically, it's unconstitutional. Ironically, they said it was unconstitutional because that bill had many subjects contained in it, not just the prohibition on city and county income taxes. Where was the AG? We notified the AG that the constitutionality of this statute was being challenged, and they declined to come in and defend it. So there is now a track record developing under the prior AG and now the current AG of saying, we're just giving legal advice. We're not really taking a position here. That's just not what the job of the Attorney General is. If the Attorney General doesn't defend the Constitution in the first instance, who will?
Rob, so putting aside whether it's good policy or bad policy to tax the citizens of Washington, because that's a question for voters, and they, as you mentioned, put it to the voters. They vote numerous times. But if the legislature says, look, we feel this is a financial emergency, and we want to get this, we need a test case because we feel this financial path that we're on without income tax, the state's going to come into crisis. We want to get a law passed that we would like to see go as a test case. Is it inappropriate for the Attorney General to say this is what you can and can't do? Not whether you should or shouldn't, but what you can or can't do in the form of making this law.
Yeah, I think the Attorney General can explain what the law is, but it's not the Attorney General's job to counsel the legislature on how they can get around that law, which is the way these emails read. This is not routine legal advice that they were giving. I mean, you even had an email to the legislature saying, don't forget to put an emergency clause in this bill so that the voters don't get to vote on it.
Now, that came from the Attorney General's office and not a legislator?
Yeah. No, that advice came from an email from the Solicitor General, who's in the Attorney General's office, to a legislator. That's one of the emails that came out in that public records request. So that goes well beyond just explaining to them what their options are to actively counseling them. And I don't think voters feel very good about that. But you're in terms of the financial situation that the state's in. Remember, when Chris Gorgar and I both left office in January of 2013, the state budget was $32 billion per biennium. So that was the 2-year budget. It's now over $80 billion per biennium, which is a huge increase. I think it's like 124%, something like that.
You can't see this, Rob, but Spike is rubbing his eyes out of frustration.
No, I voted for you, bud. Yeah. I tried to stop this from happening. I know I'm a Democrat in this state, and I know we've running unchecked as we have for the last 15 years. The state went from being one of the best states in America to do business to one of the worst states in America to do business.
Absolutely.
And now that we're chasing businesses away.
Yeah, and Spike, it's really important, and I know you guys know this, but it's not about helping businesses. It's about helping ourselves. I mean, look at the fact that we have the third highest per capita GDP in America in Washington State. We're the seventh highest in personal income per capita. And that's because we have all these phenomenal companies that employ people at really high wages. And that's all at risk now. The governor's office told a friend of mine who's a Democrat who's concerned about this, well, New York has an income tax. California has an income tax. We can have an income tax. Yeah, well, we're not New York and we're not California. We're next to Oregon, and we've done a lot better than Oregon because we've had phenomenal entrepreneurs and other founders, companies come here and grow
fertile
here,
soil for
here.
them. Yeah, up until right now.
Yeah, and But that's had a direct impact on all of us in terms of the wealth that we have in this state and that we have individually. I think if you go down and look at the different levels of people, based on their income, you'll find that even people at the lower levels are doing better than people are in, say, Oregon, right? Our wages are higher, et cetera. And we're also able to offer richer benefits to people as a result. It's because we're a wealthy state. And we're a wealthy state because we've had a number of competitive advantages, one of which is not having an income tax. We didn't used to have a capital gains tax. We got away with having a high estate tax, but then they temporarily bumped that up to 35%. But we're systematically dismantling our competitive advantages. And I think in the long run, that's one of the reasons that this tax is good. If the income tax is upheld, it's going to reach everybody because they're going to need the money, because the businesses are going to leave and some wealthier people are going to leave, and they're going to have to extend the tax in order to make up the revenue shortfalls that those departures produce.
Hey, Rob, I'm going to ask you to put your politician's hat on for just a moment. I know you've built a wonderful life and you deserve to just enjoy yourself. But when Washington created these great business opportunities, they're able to give tax breaks to companies to start and to do their business here. And we're seeing Tennessee do that now, luring Starbucks down there.
Right.
Is that just a phase states can only go through for so long? Why can't Washington offer those same type of incentives now for businesses to not leave? I mean, is that kind of a short-term boom thing that's always just runs its course?
I don't think it's short term. I mean, and I don't hear businesses asking for breaks. I hear them asking to not be hit with new and higher taxes, like the payroll tax in Seattle or the head tax, right? The increased B&O tax, which my wife is a small business owner, will point out to you, is a tax on all of her revenue, whether she's profitable or not. Every business has to pay that. We also have high sales taxes, high property taxes, et cetera, but we haven't had an income tax, which benefits pretty much everybody. And that is losing that advantage on top of having the capital gains tax enacted and increases in the B&O tax and proposed payroll taxes is what you said this a minute ago, but it's why we've fallen from one of the top states in the country as a place to do business down to being one of the last states on the list. And that's going to cost us all big time in the long run.
Well, former Attorney General Rob McKenna, who is part of this lawsuit, hopefully gets this income tax put aside, and hopefully he can fight it and it doesn't happen. Thank you so much for coming on and helping us make sense of this. We really appreciate it.
Thank you both. Take care, guys.
You too,
All right,
bud.
take care.